The telegram arrived before she did. That was the first humiliation, that a piece of paper got to Wyoming before Clara Hawthorne herself. And that paper said everything the men of Laramie needed to know before she even stepped off the train. She found out about it later, from a woman named Dot, who ran the dry goods store and had no particular talent for keeping secrets. Dot told her that Harold Finch, the rancher who'd arranged the first marriage, the one that had lasted 72 hours, had wired ahead to every single male property owner within 40 miles of Cedar Creek. The telegram read, "Sending the Hawthorne woman on westbound. Buyer beware." 3 days was all any man could stand. She didn't know about the telegram when she stepped onto the platform at Laramie with 2 trunks and a carpet bag and frost already working through her wool coat. She didn't know why the station master wouldn't meet her eyes, or why the 2 cowboys leaning against the depot wall found something very interesting to study in their boot heels when she walked past. She thought it was the cold. She thought it was just the West being the West. Blunt and indifferent, the way everyone back in Boston had warned her it would be. She found out about the telegram on her 3rd day in Laramie, sitting in Dot's store waiting for word from a man named Luke Carver, who had apparently agreed to consider her as a wife and had not yet sent any word whether he still felt that way. Dot set a cup of coffee on the counter and said, with the particular kindness of a woman who decides honesty is mercy, "Honey, Harold Finch has been busy." If you've ever had someone describe your entire worth as a human being in 11 words on a telegraph wire, you understand what Clara felt reading that message. If you've ever been reduced to a warning label, "Buyer beware," you know the particular coldness that moves through you. Not hot anger, not tears, just cold. A cold that goes deeper than Wyoming winter. She set the telegram down on Dot's counter. She picked up her coffee. She drank it. And then she said very quietly, "Does Luke Carver know about this?" Dot looked at the wall. "Most everybody does." Clara nodded slowly. "And he still hasn't sent word either way." "No." "Which means," Clara said, "he hasn't said no." Before we go any further into what happened at Cedar Creek, before we get to the wolf and the winter and the thing with the cougar that nearly ended everything, I want you to stay with us through this story. Because what happened to Clara Hawthorne in Wyoming is not a simple love story. It is not a fairy tale. It is something harder and stranger and more honest than that. And if you leave before the end, you will miss the part that matters most. If this story finds you in your city, wherever you are in the world tonight, leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know how far this has traveled. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and like this video so the next story finds you too. Now, back to Wyoming. Back to Clara Hawthorne, who had just learned she was a telegram, and who was deciding what to do about it. Well, she had come from money, which is its own kind of trap. The Hawthornes of Boston were not old money. They were the kind of family that had worked its way into respectability over 2 generations, and held on to that respectability with both hands and considerable anxiety. Her father had been a shipping merchant. Her mother had been the daughter of a shipping merchant. They had raised Clara to be an asset, which meant raising her to be agreeable, decorative, and carefully silent on any subject that mattered. The problem was that Clara had never been able to locate the silence they wanted. It wasn't that she was loud. She didn't shout or make scenes. She was, in fact, a composed woman with good posture and a measured voice. But she had opinions, and her opinions had a way of arriving uninvited into conversations where opinions were not wanted. She could not watch a man make an obvious error and simply smile and let the error stand. She had tried. She had genuinely tried. The first marriage, the one with Harold Finch, the one that had generated the telegram, had ended over a ledger book. Harold Finch was a successful rancher, 51 years old, recently widowed, looking for a sensible woman to manage his household and require minimal maintenance. Clara was 28 years old, thoroughly unmarried by Boston standards, and had come to the frontier marriage arrangement through an agency in Chicago that her mother had found through a friend of a friend and presented to Clara as a practical solution to a practical problem. Clara had not been consulted on whether she considered herself a problem requiring solution. By the time she understood what was happening, the arrangements were already made, and her mother was looking at her with that particular exhausted hope that Clara had spent her whole life trying not to disappoint. So she went. Harold Finch met her at the station in a good suit and told her she looked sensible, which he apparently meant as a compliment. She shook his hand and told him his ranch sounded impressive, which she meant as courtesy. They drove out to his property in a reasonable silence. She told herself, this could work. People build lives on less than this. On the second day, she found the ledger. Harold had left it on the kitchen table, not hidden, just set aside, the way a man sets aside something he will return to. Clara had no intention of looking at it. She was washing dishes, and she was thinking about the letter she would write to her mother, and she was deciding whether sensible was actually a compliment or whether it was the kind of word men used for women they didn't find particularly interesting. Then she saw the column. It was a simple arithmetic error, the kind that compounds, where one wrong number in March becomes a wrong number in April, and by May you have lost $300 you don't realize you've lost. She saw it the way you see something your brain doesn't even decide to see. It was just suddenly there, obvious and wrong. She dried her hands. She picked up the ledger. She looked at it for a long moment, and then she set it back down and went to find Harold. I think there's an error in your March accounts, she said. He looked at her over his coffee cup. Beg pardon? Your cattle feed expenditure in March. The column doesn't reconcile. I think you've been overcharged by the supplier for 4 months running, or you've… Clara. His voice was flat. I didn't bring you here to read my ledgers. I know, but the error is… My accounts, Harold Finch said, setting down his cup with a precise and final click, are my business. She understood then that she was not supposed to have seen the ledger. Not because it was secret, but because seeing it and knowing what it meant and saying so out loud, that was the problem. The problem was not the error. The problem was that she had noticed. She tried once more the next morning. She had spent the night writing down what she'd seen, carefully, so that it was clear. She brought him the paper and she said, I'm not trying to interfere, I just thought if you could see it laid out… Harold Finch sent her back to Laramie that afternoon, and before she even reached the station, the telegram was already on its way. The thing about being sent back is that it has a particular weight to it. It is not the same as leaving. When you leave, you made a choice. When you are sent back, someone else made the choice for you, and the choice they made was that you are not worth the trouble. Clara had sat on the train back to Laramie staring out at the snow-covered plains and understood, with a clarity that comes only from certain kinds of humiliation, that she was not going to Boston. She could not go back to her mother's house and be the woman who failed at a frontier marriage because she had looked at a ledger. She could not sit in the parlor and listen to the careful consolations of women who would be secretly relieved that she had not managed to escape them after all. She had a small inheritance from her grandmother, enough to last a year, maybe 2 if she was careful. She had her trunks. She had herself. She went to see the agency man in Laramie, a thin fellow named Prescott, who operated out of a back office above a hardware store and smelled permanently of pipe smoke. She sat down in his client chair and she told him she needed another arrangement. Prescott looked at his papers. He looked at Clara. He looked at his papers again. Miss Hawthorne, he said, I have to be honest with you. Please. Word has gotten around about the Finch situation. He cleared his throat. Most of the men I work with in this territory, they've heard, they're looking for a certain type of woman, someone who doesn't notice arithmetic errors, someone who's, he chose his word carefully, adaptable. I am adaptable, Clara said. I adapted myself out of everything I had for 28 years. I'm done adapting in that particular direction. She folded her hands in her lap. Who do you have? Prescott shuffled his papers for a long time, long enough that she began to wonder if he was going to find a reason to show her the door. Then he pulled out a single sheet and set it on the desk between them, face up, like a card in a game she didn't yet know the rules of. Luke Carver, he said. Cedar Creek Ranch, about 40 miles north of here. She read the paper. Age, 34. Property, 600 acres, cattle operation, in reasonable financial health. Widowed. No children. Looking for a wife capable of managing a frontier household. 3 brides, Prescott said, when he saw she'd reached the bottom of the page. I see that. She looked up. 3 brides in how long? 4 years. And they all left? All 3. One lasted 6 weeks. One lasted 4 months. One… He paused. One lasted 8 days. Why did they leave? Prescott considered the question. Different reasons according to each of them. The isolation, the cold, the work. He's not… Another careful pause. He's not an easy man, doesn't talk much. The ranch is remote. The winters are hard. The winters are hard everywhere up here. Yes, but at Cedar Creek, hard means something particular. He folded his hands. Miss Hawthorne, I feel I should tell you. The men in this territory, most of them won't consider you because of what happened with Finch. Luke Carver. He doesn't know the community well enough to have heard much of it yet. If you want my honest assessment, he may be your best option, but he is not an easy option. Clara looked at the paper again. The name. Cedar Creek Ranch, 600 acres. Set up the correspondence, she said. Isha. The letters between them were brief, and she would later think that the brevity itself was the most honest thing about how they started. Harold Finch had written her courtship letters full of expansive descriptions of his property and his ambitions and his vision for their future together, and none of it had been dishonest exactly, but none of it had been real in any particular way either. Luke Carver's first letter was 11 sentences. He described the ranch. He described the work. He said the winters were long and cold, and the nearest town was Mill Haven, 14 miles, and he got there maybe once a month when the roads permitted. He said he needed someone capable of managing the domestic operations of the ranch and willing to work. He said he was not a man of many words, and he preferred honesty to pleasantness, and if she was looking for the latter, he was probably not the right match. She read that letter 3 times. She wrote back 8 sentences. She described her situation plainly. The broken arrangement with Finch, the reason for it, the fact that she was not going to pretend otherwise because he would find out eventually anyway, and she preferred to have that conversation at the beginning rather than the end. She said she was capable of hard work, that she learned quickly, and that she had enough financial resources to contribute to the household if that mattered. She said she was not looking for a man to rescue her. She was looking for a situation she could build something in. She sent the letter. She waited. 8 days. Prescott found her at Dot's store on a Tuesday morning and handed her the reply without ceremony. It was 5 sentences. Your honesty is noted and appreciated. I've no interest in a woman who needs rescuing and no patience for pretending. The work is real and the winters are hard, and I'll warn you now that 3 women before you decided they'd had enough. If you understand what you're coming to and you still want to come, you're welcome to try. I'll meet you at Millhaven Station on the 14th if that suits. She read it twice. Well? Prescott asked. It suits, Clara said. Well, she told herself, on the train to Millhaven, that she had a plan. She told herself she was going in clear-eyed and practical, that she was not building expectations she would have to demolish, that this was a business arrangement between 2 people who needed something the other could provide, and that was a decent enough foundation for a life on the frontier, even if it was not the kind of thing the novels she'd read as a girl had prepared her for. She told herself all of that, and she believed most of it, right up until the moment the train pulled into Millhaven and she stepped onto the platform into the kind of cold that seems to have a personal vendetta against you. There was one man standing at the far end of the platform, separate from the small crowd of people collecting cargo and greeting arrivals. He was tall and lean in a way that suggested he hadn't spent much time indoors, with dark hair under a weathered hat and the kind of stillness about him that isn't practiced. That's just what a person looks like when they've spent years not talking to anyone they didn't have to talk to. He was looking at her. Not in the appraising way men sometimes looked at women arriving off trains, calculating their assets, checking the merchandise. He was looking at her the way you look at something you're trying to understand. She walked toward him, which required stepping around 2 other passengers and a crate of chickens that had strong feelings about the cold, and she stopped about 3 feet away and said, "You're Luke Carver." "You're Clara Hawthorne," he said. His voice was low and even, neither warm nor unfriendly. "You're smaller than I expected." "You're quieter than I expected," she said, and then wondered immediately if that had been a mistake. He considered her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not amusement exactly, but something adjacent to it. "I've got a wagon," he said. "It's a long drive. You should know the roads are rough." "I've been warned about the roads." "You've been warned about a lot of things," he said. "Come on then." He picked up one of her trunks. She picked up the other. He looked at her, clearly having assumed he would carry both, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything about it, and they walked to the wagon. The drive to Cedar Creek Ranch was 3 hours, and for the first hour, neither of them spoke. This would have bothered Clara in almost any other circumstance. She was not a woman who tolerated silence as a social strategy, who sat quietly and waited for the other person to feel uncomfortable enough to talk. But the silence in the wagon with Luke Carver did not feel like a strategy. It felt like weather, like something that simply existed and wasn't directed at her personally. She looked at the landscape instead, the flatness of it, the enormous reach of the sky, the way the winter light came down gray and even on the snow-covered ground, so that the world seemed to have had all its shadows removed. She had expected to be frightened of it. She found to her slight surprise that she wasn't. It was indifferent, this landscape. It did not care about her at all. After 28 years of being in rooms where everyone cared very specifically about what she was doing wrong, indifference was something close to relief. "You're not from ranch country," Luke said finally, when they were perhaps an hour out of Millhaven. "No, Boston." "I know, Prescott told me." He was quiet a moment. "Why'd you come west?" "Marriage prospects in Boston require a woman to be agreeable in a particular way. And you're not agreeable in that way." "I'm agreeable in other ways," Clara said. "I'm honest. I'm punctual. I don't complain about things that can't be changed. I learn quickly, and I don't make the same mistake twice. But I can't seem to manage the kind of agreeable that means watching something go wrong and staying quiet about it." Luke said nothing for a moment. The horses moved steadily through the cold. "What went wrong with Finch?" he asked. She told him. All of it. The ledger, the arithmetic, her attempt to show him, his response. She told it plainly, without embellishment or apology, and when she finished, Luke was quiet for a long time. "He was losing money," Luke said finally. "Yes. 4 months of overcharging from his feed supplier, possibly longer. I don't know if he ever caught it." Another silence. "Man's a fool," Luke said, which was not what she had expected him to say. "He felt that I overstepped." "You saved him $300 and he sent you back on a train." Luke's voice held no particular heat, just the flat assessment of a man evaluating a situation. "That's a fool." Clara looked at the side of his face, the jaw set under a beard that had gone a few days past trimming, the eyes fixed on the road ahead. She said, "You're not bothered by it, the ledger." "Why would I be bothered? You noticed something. You said something." He glanced at her sideways. "I'd rather have someone who says something than someone who watches the barn burn and doesn't mention it." She turned back to the road and felt something unknot in her chest that she had not entirely realized was knotted. They drove the second hour in a different kind of silence. Not empty, but settled, the way a room feels when the furniture has been arranged properly and there's no more need to move things around. Then he said, "I need to tell you something about the ranch." The way he said it made her look at him again. "The women who left," he said. "I'm not going to tell you they were wrong to go. The conditions are hard, it's isolated, the work is real, and there's no softening it." He kept his eyes on the road. "What I will tell you is that I didn't deceive any of them about what they were coming to. Prescott made sure they understood. And they came anyway, and they left anyway, and I don't hold that against them." "But," Clara said, because there was clearly a but. "But I'm not doing it a fourth time," he said. "If you come to Cedar Creek and you decide it's not what you want, I'll take you back to Millhaven myself, no hard feelings. But I need you to be honest with me. Don't stay because you're too proud to say you made a mistake, and don't leave without telling me why." He paused. "The women who left, none of them told me what the real reason was. They just left, and I'd rather know." It was the longest speech she had heard from him, and it cost him something. She could see that in the set of his shoulders, the way he'd looked at the road the entire time. This was not a man accustomed to explaining himself. "I'll tell you," she said. "If I want to go, I'll tell you." He nodded once. That was all. The third hour they talked about the ranch. He asked her practical questions, what she could cook, what animals she had experience with, whether she had ever handled a firearm. She answered honestly. She could cook adequately. She had some experience with horses from childhood summers, and she had never handled a firearm but was willing to learn. He told her there were 4 horses, 23 head of cattle, a barn that needed a new roof section in the spring, and a root cellar that was better stocked than it looked. When Cedar Creek Ranch appeared out of the gathering dusk, the main house first, then the barn beyond it, the fence lines barely visible in the failing light, Clara looked at it and thought, this is real. This is an actual place where an actual life would be lived. It was smaller than she'd imagined, Not mean or falling down. Maintained, clearly, by someone who cared about keeping things from getting worse. But plain. Austere. A house that was exactly what it needed to be and nothing more. It's smaller than what you're used to, Luke said. I'm not marrying the house, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he climbed down from the wagon. They were married the following Sunday in Mill Haven, with Prescott as witness and a circuit judge who made the drive out once a month and seemed to have heard the name Luke Carver enough times that he completed the ceremony with the focused efficiency of a man who had been here before. There was no celebration. There was no party. Clara wore her blue traveling dress because it was the most appropriate thing she owned, and Luke wore a coat she suspected was the same one he'd worn to at least one previous wedding, and they signed the papers and shook the judge's hand and drove back to Cedar Creek in the cold. That night, Luke made coffee and set a cup in front of her without asking how she took it, and she added the sugar herself, and they sat at the kitchen table and he said, "The chickens need feeding at first light. I'll show you the system tomorrow." "All right," she said, "and the stove takes some managing. The flue pulls left." "I'll remember." He looked at her across the table. Not the calculating look, not the assessing look, something else. Something she didn't quite have a name for. Like he was checking whether she was still there, whether she was real, whether she intended to be real. "You're not what I expected," he said. "You said that at the station," she said. "You said I was smaller." "That's not what I mean now." She waited. "The others," he said, "were—" He stopped. Started again. "They were nice women, good women. They tried." His jaw worked slightly. "But they came here looking for something. I could see them looking for it, that first week. Looking around at the ranch, at me, waiting for whatever they thought was going to appear. And when it didn't appear, they left." "What did they think was going to appear?" "I don't know," he said, and she believed him. "Something. A version of this that was—" He shook his head. "Something warmer than this actually is, maybe." Clara wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "I'm not looking for warm," she said. "I'm looking for real." Luke looked at her for a long moment. "This is real," he said. "I know," she said. "I can tell." Outside, the Wyoming wind moved across the valley with a sound like water, and the fire in the stove clicked and settled, and Clara Hawthorne, who was now, by law and by choice, Clara Carver, sat in a kitchen in the middle of a cold frontier night with a man she barely knew and felt, for the first time in a long time, exactly where she was. Not where she wanted to be yet. Not safe. Not certain. But exactly where she was. Which was, she had decided somewhere on the long drive north from Mill Haven, the only honest place to start. The first week was instruction. Luke showed her everything without commentary, where the tools were, how the barn was organized, which of the horses could be trusted, and which was still making up its mind about her, the particular needs of the root cellar in deep winter, how to bank the stove at night so the house didn't go cold before morning. He showed her these things with the same manner he'd used on the drive from Mill Haven, even, economical, watching to see if she was following. She followed. She made mistakes. She left a gate latch in a way that wasn't secure, and Luke fixed it without comment, but she noticed him fixing it and went back to look at the latch and understood immediately what she'd done wrong, and she never did it again. She underestimated how long it took to haul water from the well when the ground was frozen and arrived late to the kitchen with cold hands and was 20 minutes behind on the morning meal, and Luke ate what was ready without expression. She oversalted the beans on Thursday. She told him it was too salty before he tasted them. He tasted them anyway. He ate them anyway. "You didn't have to eat them," she said. "Food is food," he said. "Salt won't kill me." On Friday, she found a problem with one of the horse stalls, a board that had been repaired but not repaired properly, and was working loose in a way that would become a problem in another week or two. She could have fixed it herself, but she wasn't certain she'd do it right, and she had decided that her pride could wait until she understood what she was doing. "There's a board in the gray mare's stall," she told him. "Third one from the back. It's been repaired before, but it's coming loose again." He went and looked at it and came back and got the right tools and fixed it that afternoon. He didn't say anything. But that evening at dinner, he gave her a slightly larger portion of the stew, and she understood that was as close to thank you as he was likely to get in the first week, and it was enough. She wrote her mother a letter that Saturday evening, sitting at the kitchen table after Luke had gone to bed. She wrote carefully, weighing each sentence because she knew her mother would read between every line for evidence of misery or disaster. "The ranch is smaller than I expected," she wrote. "The work is hard. The cold is real. Mr. Carver is not a warm man, but I think he is an honest one, and I find I prefer that to the alternative. I am learning the systems of this place. I intend to be useful." She did not write, "I think I may have made the right choice." That was too early. That would be hubris. That would be the kind of thing she'd written in her head on the train to Harold Finch's ranch and had spent 3 days dismantling. But she thought it. She thought it carefully and quietly and put it away. The trouble came at the end of the second week, and it came from a direction she hadn't anticipated. His name was Garrett Webb, and he ranched the property east of Cedar Creek, a larger operation, better staffed, the kind of place that had done well in the last few years by methods that the people of Mill Haven discussed in the careful voices people use when they want to talk about something they can't quite prove. He came to Cedar Creek on a gray Thursday morning, riding up to the gate with 2 men behind him who didn't get off their horses. Clara was in the barn when she heard the horses. She came out and found Garrett Webb looking at her the way she'd been looked at by certain men her whole life. The sizing up look, the assessment, the quick mental calculation of what she was worth and what she might be useful for. He was maybe 40, big through the shoulders, with a red face and the manner of a man who had been agreed with for so long that disagreement had become genuinely surprising to him. "You're the new wife," he said. "Clara Carver," she said. "Can I help you?" "Where's Luke?" "He's out checking the east fence line. I can take a message, or you can wait." Webb looked at her a moment longer than necessary. "You're the Boston woman." She noted the way he said it, not as information, as a category. The Boston woman. Like it explained something unflattering. "I am," she said. "Would you like to come inside while you wait?" "I'll wait here." He leaned forward on his saddle horn. "You know much about the property lines between Cedar Creek and my operation?" "I know the general boundaries, yes. The creek tributary that runs between us." He said it like she probably didn't know what tributary meant. "There's been some question about usage rights. The water level's been lower than usual this winter. I need to talk to Luke about how it gets divided going forward." Clara looked at him steadily. She had seen this look before, not on ranchers, but on certain businessmen in Boston who came to see her father wearing their authority like a coat they expected everyone to admire. She recognized the shape of what he was saying and what he wasn't saying. "The tributary that runs into Cedar Creek's south pasture," she said. Something in his expression shifted slightly, just slightly. "You know the one?" he said. "Luke mentioned it. He's maintained the channel for the last 4 years. She kept her voice even. "That kind of maintenance typically establishes usage rights under territorial water law, but I'm sure that's something you and Luke can discuss." Webb looked at her for a moment. The 2 men behind him were very still. "You know water law," Webb said flatly. "I know enough," she said. The conversation ended shortly after that. Webb said he'd come back when Luke was available. He rode out without ceremony, without looking back, and Clara stood at the barn door and watched him go. When Luke came back 3 hours later and she told him about the visit, he stood very still for a long moment. "What did you say to him about the tributary?" he asked. She told him. Exactly what she'd said. Luke looked at her for a long moment with that expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that meant he was recalculating something. "Webb's been trying to claim shared usage rights on that water for 2 years, he said. "I've been fighting it. There's a question of whether I have documentation of the maintenance work I've done." "Do you have documentation?" "Some. Not organized." "Then we should organize it," she said. Another long moment. He said, "You know how to do that?" "Show me what you have," she said. He brought out the records that evening, receipts, work logs, a few scattered notes he'd made over the years. She spread them on the kitchen table and worked through them methodically while he sat across from her and watched. She made a list of what they had and what gaps existed and what kind of documentation would be most useful to establish the maintenance record clearly. "There's enough here," she said finally. "It's not perfect, but it's enough to start with. You need a lawyer to look at it, but you should have a case." Luke looked at the organized papers on the table. He looked at her. He said, "The last time a woman organized my papers, she was getting ready to tell me she was leaving." Clara met his eyes directly. "I'm not leaving," she said. "I just started." Something moved across his face, something complicated and unguarded, there and gone in an instant, like the shadow of a bird passing over open ground. He looked back down at the papers. "All right," he said. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved across Cedar Creek in the dark, carrying cold and distance and the particular quality of silence that belongs only to the frontier night. Inside, two people sat at a kitchen table with a lamp between them and a problem to solve. And somewhere in that entirely ordinary, entirely unromantic moment, something shifted that neither of them had a name for yet. But it had started. And Clara Carver, who had been sent back once already, intended to still be here when it finished. The papers stayed on the kitchen table for 3 days. Not because they were forgotten. Clara moved them to one side each morning to clear space for meals and moved them back each evening. But because the problem they represented didn't have a quick solution, and she had learned early in life that rushing a problem that required patience was how you turned a manageable difficulty into a real one. She made notes in the margins of her own copy. She organized Luke's maintenance records by date, by type of work, by the names of any witnesses who had been present when repairs were made. There weren't many witnesses. The nature of Cedar Creek Ranch was that Luke had done most things alone. That was the gap. That was what Garrett Webb would use if it came to a legal dispute. Not that the records were false, but that they were unwitnessed, uncorroborated, the private account of a man with an obvious interest in the outcome. She was thinking about this on the 4th morning when she went out to feed the horses and found the gray mare favoring her left foreleg. The mare's name was Iris, which Luke had not told her and which she had discovered by accident when she'd been brushing the horse down 2 days after arriving and said aloud, mostly to herself, "You need a name." And Luke had said from the barn doorway, "She has one. It's Iris." As if the horse's name were something self-evident that Clara had simply not bothered to learn, which was, she supposed, fair. Iris was standing at the back of her stall with her weight shifted, and when Clara went in to look, the leg was not swollen, but the horse held it with a tension that said clearly enough that something was wrong. Clara was not a horse doctor, she knew that much. She knew also that a lame horse in winter on a working cattle ranch was a serious problem in a way it might not have been on a different kind of property. And she stood there in the cold barn looking at Iris and made a quick decision about what she did and did not know. She went and found Luke. He was at the woodpile behind the house, splitting logs with the focused economy of a man who had done this so many times that the motion had become automatic. He looked up when he heard her boots on the frozen ground. "Iris is favoring her left foreleg," she said. "I can't tell what's wrong." He set the axe down and came. He spent 10 minutes with the mare, running his hands carefully over the leg, checking the hoof, watching her move 2 steps and then stop. Clara stood outside the stall and watched him work. He was different with the horses than he was with people. Not exactly gentle, but patient in a way he didn't always manage with words, taking time to let the animal understand what he was doing before he did it. "Stone bruise," he said finally. "Nothing broken. She needs to rest the leg." "How long?" "Week? Maybe 10 days?" He straightened up. "Means I'll need to take the bay on the east rounds instead. Is the bay reliable for that?" He looked at her. "Why?" "You said last week he was still making up his mind about you." Luke considered this. "He'll be fine. He just needs handling." "All right," she paused. "Do you want me to do the east fence check tomorrow so you can use the time on the web documentation?" He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that she had learned was not resistance but processing. Luke Carver turned things over before he spoke about them, and she had stopped mistaking the silence for hostility. "The east line goes 3 miles, he said. "You know what you're looking for. Show me today, and I'll do it tomorrow." He showed her that afternoon. They walked the east fence line together in the cold, and he explained what he checked and why, and what a problem looked like versus what was just winter wear. She asked questions, and he answered them without impatience, and by the time they turned back toward the house, her feet were numb inside her boots, and she had a clear enough picture to manage it alone. That night he sat down with her at the kitchen table, and they worked on the water rights documentation together. He was better at remembering the details when she asked specific questions. The year he'd cleared the channel obstruction, who had supplied the rock he'd used to reinforce the bank, whether any Millhaven residents had ridden out that way during the work. She wrote everything down. The picture that emerged was more complete than she'd expected. "You should send for James Alderley," she said. Luke looked up from the paper he'd been studying, The Lawyer in Mill Haven. He handled the Prescott land dispute last year, according to Dot. She said he was thorough. She met Luke's eyes. Webb isn't going to stop. He's the kind of man who stops only when it costs him more to continue than to accept the situation. You need someone who can make it cost him. Luke was quiet for a long moment. Alderley doesn't come cheap. Neither does losing the water rights. Another silence. He looked back at the papers. I'll send a letter tomorrow, he said. It was not a dramatic moment. It was two people sitting at a kitchen table in the middle of a Wyoming winter making a practical decision. But later, Clara would mark it as the first moment she understood that Luke Carver, for all his self-sufficiency and his 3 failed marriages and his reputation for being as approachable as a closed door, was a man who could change his mind when someone gave him a good reason. That was worth knowing. The snow started in earnest the following week, and it changed everything about the rhythm of the ranch in ways that Clara had understood intellectually and now understood in her body. The cold at Cedar Creek in deep winter was not the cold she had known in Boston. Boston cold was real, but it was city cold. You moved through it from building to building, from warmth to warmth, with the understanding that relief was always close. Wyoming winter cold was a different animal entirely. It sat on the land like something that lived there, like something that had been there before anyone arrived and would be there long after, and you could not argue with it or negotiate with it or wait it out with any particular confidence. You simply had to work inside it, and so she did. She learned to dress in layers that she put on in a specific order, because the order mattered. She learned to check the water line to the barn each morning before anything else, because if it froze, the horses couldn't drink, and an animal that couldn't drink in that cold would go downhill faster than she'd thought possible. She learned to read the quality of the cold, the difference between 15 degrees above zero, which was uncomfortable but manageable, and 5 below, which required a different set of calculations about how long you could be outside before your hands stopped working properly. Luke watched her learn without commentary. This, she had decided, was his version of support. He did not offer encouragement. He did not say, "Well done." He did not smooth her way by taking over when she was struggling. But he also did not criticize when she made the inevitable small errors. And when something was genuinely dangerous, he told her without drama and expected her to listen, which she did. One morning in the 3rd week of heavy snow, she came in from the barn with her face reddened and her fingers barely functional and stood over the stove for 10 minutes before she could feel them properly again. Luke poured coffee and set it on the counter near her without being asked. "The cattle water trough in the south pasture has a crack," she said when she could feel her hands again. "Small, but it's going to widen." He looked up from the harness he'd been mending. "I noticed it yesterday," she said. "I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure how serious it was. I looked at it again this morning. It's serious." "I'll go out this afternoon," he said. "I can help." "You've been out for 3 hours. And in 2 hours I'll be warm again and I can go back out." She picked up the coffee cup. "Show me what the repair looks like. I can at least hand you things." He did not argue with her about it. That was something she had come to appreciate. Luke did not argue about things once she'd made a reasonable case. He simply accepted the new information and adjusted. She found this peculiarly more respectful than a man who said, "Of course, whatever you think," which in her experience meant he hadn't been listening at all. They went out together in the early afternoon and fixed the trough while the temperature dropped and the wind picked up from the northwest. And it was miserable work with cold hands and boots that stopped feeling like they belonged to her somewhere around the 2nd hour. But the trough got fixed. Coming back across the south pasture in the declining light, Clara stumbled on a frozen rut hidden under new snow and went down hard on one knee. She was up again in a second. The ground was too cold to stay on, but the knee throbbed with a persistence that told her she'd hit it properly. Luke had stopped. He was looking at her with that particular expression she was beginning to catalog. Not alarm, not warmth, but a focused attention that meant he was checking whether she was all right. "I'm fine," she said. "You're limping." "I'll limp better once we're inside." He said nothing for a moment. Then he adjusted his pace. Not by much, not obviously, just enough that she didn't have to push to keep up. And they walked back to the house that way, with the snow beginning again and the early dark coming down fast. She noticed him adjust his pace. She didn't say anything about it. Some things, she had learned, were communicated better by not remarking on them. Garrett Webb came back on a Tuesday. This time Luke was home, and he came out of the barn when he heard horses in the yard. Clara came out of the house. She wasn't sure what she intended to do. She wasn't going to insert herself into a conversation between two men if Luke was handling it. But she found she didn't want to be inside not knowing what was being said. Webb had 3 men with him this time, which was 2 more than necessary for a conversation. Carver, Webb said, in the way that some men say a name, like the word itself is a slight. Webb. Luke's voice was the same as always, which was to say, flat and even and giving nothing away. Heard you sent for Alderley. Luke said nothing. That's a waste of your money, Webb said. The tributary situation is straightforward. Water level's been down all winter. I've got cattle on my east pasture that need that water, and there's enough for both operations if we work out a fair sharing arrangement. We have a sharing arrangement, Luke said. It's called the existing water rights. Rights that aren't clearly documented, Webb said. They're documented well enough. Luke's voice hadn't changed, but something in the set of his shoulders had. Alderley's going to agree with me on that. Webb looked past Luke and found Clara standing near the house. He looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite a smile. Your wife been helping you with that? He said. The documentation. My wife, Luke said, and there was something different in the way he said the 2 words, has a good eye for records. Yes. Webb made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. A Boston woman playing frontier lawyer. He looked back at Luke. Carver, this doesn't have to be unpleasant. I'm offering you a fair arrangement. What you're offering, Luke said, is half of what's mine. I don't call that fair. Webb's expression shifted. The performance of reasonableness dropped a fraction. The water situation in this valley is going to get harder before it gets easier, Webb said. Dry summer's coming. You don't want to go into that with an enemy on your eastern border. I don't choose my enemies, Luke said. They choose themselves. There was a silence. One of Webb's men shifted in his saddle. Clara stood very still near the house and watched Webb's face go through several different calculations. Alderley's a reasonable man, Webb said finally, pulling his horse around. He'll see the sense of an arrangement. Then you'll hear from him, Luke said. Webb rode out. Luke watched him go. Clara came across the yard and stood beside Luke in the cold, and they both watched until Webb and his men were out of sight past the fence line. He's not going to stop, she said. No. The summer comment wasn't casual. He's thinking ahead. He's been thinking ahead for 2 years. Luke turned back toward the barn. Alderley's coming next week. We'll see where we are after that. She walked with him back toward the barn, and she thought about the way Luke had said my wife. Not as a correction, not as a possession, but as something else, like a fact he was still getting used to, but had decided was true. The first real crisis came not from Webb, but from the land itself, which was, in the end, more honest about its hostility. It was the last week of January. The temperature had dropped to 15 below for 3 consecutive nights, which even Luke said was worse than usual, and the snowpack was deep enough that the cattle in the north pasture had to be moved because they couldn't reach the grass beneath it. This required a full day of work in conditions that wanted very badly to end you, moving 23 head of cattle through deep snow in that cold, getting them settled in the lower pasture, checking each animal for signs of cold stress, breaking ice on the water troughs twice before giving up and hauling water by hand. Clara did the water hauling while Luke handled the cattle. She made 9 trips with the heavy buckets from the well to the trough, and by the end of the 9th trip she had stopped feeling her shoulders in any meaningful way and was operating on the grim arithmetic of one more time, just one more time until it was done. When it was done, she went inside and sat down on the kitchen floor because the chairs seemed too far away, and she sat there for a while with her back against the wall and her arms in her lap thinking about nothing in particular, which was what her mind did when it had used up most of its resources. Luke came in 30 minutes later and found her there. She saw him register what he was looking at, a woman sitting on the kitchen floor, not collapsed, not crying, just existing at the lowest comfortable elevation. And he did not say anything alarmed or solicitous. He went to the stove and put the kettle on, and then came and sat down on the floor beside her, which she had not expected at all. He sat with his back against the wall too, close enough that she could feel the cold radiating off his coat before it started to give way to warmth. 9 trips, she said after a while. I counted 4 before I stopped watching from the barn, he said. Figured you were going to keep going. Seemed like the thing to do. He was quiet for a moment. You didn't have to do the water runs. Someone did. Another silence. The kettle began to build toward a boil. Clara, he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the middle distance, not at her, in the way he looked when something was difficult to say. I've been thinking about the women who left, he said. She waited. The second one, Margaret. She lasted 4 months. She was capable, willing. He stopped, started again. I came in one evening and she was sitting at the table crying, and I didn't know what to do with that. I stood there and I didn't say anything, and eventually I went back outside. He looked at his hands. She was gone 2 weeks later. Clara let that sit for a moment. You think that's why she left? I think that was part of it. His voice held no self-pity, just the tone of a man examining a thing he'd done wrong long enough that the self-examination had become factual. I didn't know how to be present for it, so I left instead. And now? She asked. He finally looked at her. His eyes were dark and serious, and something in them was working hard at something she didn't fully have access to yet. I'm sitting on the kitchen floor, he said. She looked at him for a moment, then she looked back at the middle distance. That's a start, she said. The kettle boiled. He got up and made tea. She had discovered a tin of tea in the back of a cabinet, left over from Margaret probably, and had not said anything about it. And he brought her a cup and sat back down, and they drank it on the kitchen floor while the stove ticked and the wind shook the window glass in its frames. It was not a warm moment, exactly. It was not the kind of moment she'd been led to understand was the foundation of a marriage. But it was real, and it was his, and it was freely given, and she thought, that is more than a lot of people get. James Alderley arrived the following Tuesday on a horse that looked like it had strong opinions about Wyoming winters, and all of them were negative. He was a compact man of maybe 55 with the methodical eyes of someone who reads every word of every document before he forms an opinion, which Clara found immediately reassuring. He sat at the kitchen table with the water rights documentation spread before him and spent 40 minutes reading without speaking. Luke sat across the table looking at the wall. Clara made coffee and then sat down too, because she had done a significant amount of work on those documents, and she intended to be present for the verdict. Alderley set down the last paper. It's workable, he said. Not airtight, but workable. The maintenance records establish a pattern of use and improvement going back far enough to support a prior rights claim. He looked at Luke. Webb's going to argue the records are self-serving. They are self-serving, Luke said. They're also accurate. Yes, and that's what we'll argue. Alderley picked up one page in particular, Clara's organized summary of the timeline, with dates and cross-references to the receipts. He studied it for a moment. Whoever put this together did good work. My wife, Luke said. Alderley looked at Clara. She held his gaze. You've done this kind of work before, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I've organized docs, she said. I noticed what was missing and tried to fill the gaps from what Luke remembered. Alderley nodded slowly. There are 2 gaps that concern me, the spring of 1881 and the fall of 1882. If Webb can establish that the channel went unmanaged during those periods, he can argue the maintenance pattern was inconsistent and therefore the prior rights claim is weaker. The spring of 1881, I was dealing with a sick animal situation, Luke said. Took 6 weeks. I didn't get out to the channel until late April. Is there any record of the animal situation? Anything that would establish what you were occupied with during that period? Luke thought. I bought medicine from the feed store in Mill Haven. March of 1881. A receipt? Might be one in the old records box. They spent another hour going through the old records box, which was in a condition that suggested it had not been approached with any organizational intent. Clara found the receipt from March 1881 at the bottom, folded into a letter about something else entirely. Alderley took it and added it to his pile. When he left in the late afternoon, he took the documentation with him and left behind a list of additional information he needed and a sense that he was the kind of man who would do exactly what he said he would do. Clara stood in the cold yard watching him ride out and felt the first clean loosening of something that had been tight in her chest since the night she'd organized those papers. Luke came to stand beside her. He's good, she said. He's expensive. Worth it. Luke looked sideways at her. You sound certain. Webb's banking on you not having the documentation to fight him. Now you do. She turned back toward the house. He'll have to find another angle. That'll take him time. And time costs him too. Luke was quiet for a moment, and she heard his boots on the frozen ground behind her as he followed her toward the house. "Where did you learn to think like that?" he asked. She stopped on the porch step and turned around. He was just below her on the ground, which put them at almost the same height, and she looked at him in the late afternoon light with the wind moving across the valley around them. "From watching men like Webb for 28 years, she said, and never being in a position to do anything about them." Something moved across his face. That expression she still didn't quite have a name for. "You're in a position now," he said. "I know," she said. "I intend to use it." She went inside. After a moment, she heard him follow. February came in on the back of the worst cold snap yet, and somewhere in the middle of it, things between them began to change in a way that neither of them named and neither of them pointed at directly, which was probably wise because naming a thing too early has a way of making it fragile. It started with small things. Luke began to tell her, without being asked, what his plans were for each day. Not as a report, not as instruction, just as information. The way you speak to someone whose awareness of your whereabouts has become natural and expected. She began to know where things were on the ranch without having to ask, and when Luke noticed this, noticed her finding the right tool without stopping to think about it, or knowing to check the east fence after a hard wind because that was the section that always got the worst of it, she would catch him watching her with the look she'd started to think of as the recalculation look, as if he was continually updating some internal accounting of who she was. She began to understand the particular quality of his silences, which were not all the same. The silence at the end of a hard day was comfortable, settling, a silence that had no questions in it. The silence when he was working through a problem was slightly pressurized, and she learned to leave it alone. There was another silence, rarer, that she encountered for the first time on a Sunday evening when the wind had stopped for once, and the ranch sat very still under the stars. A silence that felt like it was reaching towards something, like it had something in it that hadn't found a way out yet. She was sitting at the table reading. She had a small stack of books she'd brought from Boston, and she rationed them carefully, one chapter at a time, making them last. And Luke was at the other end of the table doing nothing in particular, which was unusual because Luke was not a man who did nothing in particular. She looked up and found him looking at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. She looked back at her book. 2 paragraphs later. "Luke." "Yeah." "What were you thinking about?" A long pause. "Whether you were going to be all right here," he said. "When spring comes and the work gets harder." She looked up again. "You're still waiting for me to leave." He didn't deny it. "I've been wrong before." "About the others." "About people in general." He looked at his hands on the table. "I make the same mistakes men make who've been alone too long. I assume the worst because it's been the most accurate." Clara set her book down. "I'm not leaving, Luke," she said, and she meant it to be simple and clear, and it was. "I've been rejected by enough of the world that I'm not in the habit of looking for the exit. When I came here, I came to stay. That hasn't changed." He was quiet for a long moment. "Margaret used to say she was happy," he said. "Right up until she left." "I'm not happy in the way Margaret probably meant it," Clara said. "I'm not soft here or comfortable or sure of things yet. My hands hurt every morning, and I'm still getting the hang of the stove, and there are days I'm more exhausted than I've ever been in my life." She held his gaze. "But I'm not leaving. There's a difference between difficult and wrong, and I've been in situations that were both, and this is only the first one." Luke looked at her for a long moment. "I believe you," he said. And something in the way he said it told her that was not a thing he said easily. She picked her book back up. He went back to whatever he was doing with his hands on the table, which she could now see was tracing the edge of a knot in the wood without being aware of it. An absent, private habit that she was fairly certain he'd never shown anyone before. Outside, the frozen Wyoming night held Cedar Creek in its cold grip, and the stars were hard and brilliant in the clear sky. And in the house on the edge of the valley, a man and a woman sat at a kitchen table in the particular quiet of 2 people who have decided, without ceremony, to trust each other. It was not love yet. It was not close enough to love to call it that. But it was the shape of something true beginning to form, the way ice forms on still water, quietly, along the edges, spreading inward from every boundary at once, until one morning you look and the whole surface has changed, and you cannot point to the exact moment it happened. It was enough. For now, in the middle of a Wyoming February with the cold pressing in from every side and the ranch demanding everything they had, it was more than enough. March came in the way Wyoming months often did, not with any particular announcement, just a gradual shift in the quality of the light, the cold still absolute but the days running a few minutes longer on each end, enough that you noticed it the way you notice a headache beginning to ease. Not gone, not even close to gone, but different. Clara noticed it first on a Thursday morning when she went out to feed the horses and realized she could see the fence line in the east pasture without the lantern. She stood in the barn doorway for a moment with the lantern burning uselessly in her hand and looked at the gray-blue light coming over the ridge and felt something in her chest that wasn't happiness exactly, but was related to it. The specific relief of a person who has been tested for a long time and is beginning to understand they are going to pass. She had been at Cedar Creek for just over 2 months. Her hands had changed. She noticed this in small ways. The calluses that had formed along her palm where the bucket handles sat. The way her fingers moved now when she latched a gate, with a sureness that hadn't been there in December. Her body had reorganized itself around the work, the way a body does when it stops arguing with what's being asked of it and just gets on with it. She was not comfortable in the frontier sense. She wasn't sure she'd ever be comfortable in the frontier sense. But she was competent, which she had decided was worth considerably more. Luke had noticed too. She could tell by the way he'd stopped watching her quite so closely when she was doing things she'd had to be shown how to do. He still watched her, but differently. Not checking for errors, just aware of her, the way you're aware of someone who has become part of the landscape of your daily life. The cougar tracks appeared on a Monday. Luke found them in the snow along the north fence line during his morning rounds, and he came back to the house and told her about them with the specific economy of someone who is assessing a situation while they describe it. Mountain lion, he said, big one, moving south along the ridge. Clara looked up from the bread she was shaping. How close to the cattle? Close enough. He poured himself coffee without sitting down, which she had learned meant he was still in motion in his mind, still working through something. Haskell's ranch, the one up the valley from here. He lost 2 calves last fall. Didn't know what to it until his hired man found tracks. Did he deal with it? Shot at it once. Missed. Animal moved off for a while. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. It's back. She looked at him. You think it's the same one? Track size says yes. She finished shaping the loaf and set it aside. What do you do about it? Watch the cattle. Keep them closer in at night if I can manage it. And... He stopped. And track it, she said. That's one option. That's the option you're considering. He looked at her directly for a moment. I've done it before. I know the terrain. Alone? Usually. She picked up the bread pan and moved to the stove and thought about this for a moment. A mountain lion, a big one, moving south along the ridge. Luke going out alone into difficult terrain to track it. The same Luke who had told her, without inflection, that the second woman he'd been married to had found him sitting on the floor of the barn one morning after a bad night and had packed her things 2 weeks later. Tell me what tracking it looks like, she said. He told her. It was not a quick process, following the sign through the snow, understanding where the animal was moving and why, getting ahead of its pattern to set up in the right position. It could take a day. It could take 3. It depended on the terrain and the weather and the animal's decisions, none of which you could predict with certainty. And while you're out there, she said, the ranch. You'd manage. It wasn't a question. Something about that steadied her. Not his confidence in her exactly, but the fact that it wasn't even a question to him anymore. I know I'd manage, she said. I'm asking if that's the plan. If the weather holds, I'd want to go in the next 2 or 3 days, before the animal gets any closer to the herd. She nodded slowly. She turned back to the stove and was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Show me how to load the rifle before you go. Luke set down his coffee cup. Clara, not to go after it, she said. In case something comes near the barn while you're gone, I'd rather know how to use it and not need to than the opposite. He looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. He showed her that afternoon. The rifle was a Winchester, heavy and serious in her hands, and he showed her how to load it and how to hold it and what to do and what not to do with the same patient economy he used to show her everything. She was not a natural with it. The kick surprised her the first time she fired it at the fence post he'd set up, and she had to set the rifle down and press her shoulder for a moment before she was ready to try again. The second shot was better. The third was better than that. "You'll do," Luke said. "I won't need to use it," she said. "Probably not," he agreed, "but you'll do." He left on a Wednesday morning before full light. She stood in the yard and watched him go, horse and rider, moving out through the gray pre-dawn toward the north ridge, smaller and smaller until the light swallowed them. She had not asked him to be careful. It would have embarrassed them both, and it would not have changed anything about the way he went. She had simply said, the night before, "Come back with the problem solved," and he had said, "That's the plan," and that had been the whole of it. She went back inside and started the morning. The first day alone was the most instructive. She understood the difference between knowing what to do and doing it without anyone else present to create the rhythm of the day. At Cedar Creek, the rhythm had always been partly Luke's. His movements set a tempo that she worked around and within. Without him, she had to create the tempo herself, and she found that it came from the animals more than anything else. The horses needed feeding at dawn. Iris, whose leg had healed clean, was happy enough now, but the bay that Luke had taken was the horse she'd been most uncertain about, and his absence simplified the barn routine in one direction while complicating it in another. She had one less horse to manage, but one more unknown to worry about. She did the fence check on the east line herself, because Luke had noted that the east fence was always worth checking after a cold snap, and there had been one the night before. She walked the 3 miles in the stiff morning cold and found one section where a post had heaved in the freeze and needed resetting, which she managed imperfectly but adequately, packing the ground back in around the base and bracing it with a rock until Luke could do it properly. The cattle she checked twice, morning and again at dusk. 23 animals, all present. She counted them carefully each time, not because she doubted herself, but because it was the kind of thing that if you stopped doing carefully because you were tired or cold or sure of yourself, it was exactly then that something went wrong. She wrote in the notebook she'd started keeping, a simple log, dates and observations, what she'd checked and what she'd found, because she had come to understand that in this place, records were not bureaucracy. They were survival. The first night alone was harder than she'd expected. Not frightened, she was not frightened in any simple way. The rifle was loaded and leaning against the wall beside the bedroom door, and she had checked the barn and the yard before dark, and she knew the sounds the house made in the night, its particular conversations with the wind. But the absence of another person in the house was something her body registered on some animal level that she could not fully reason past, a low-frequency alertness that kept pulling her back from the edge of sleep. She lay in the dark and thought about Luke out on the ridge, where he'd make camp, whether the cold was worse at elevation, whether the animal he was tracking had any particular feeling about being tracked. She thought about the 3 women who had left Cedar Creek, and she thought, was this it? Was this the moment that broke them? Not one dramatic crisis, but the accumulating weight of solitude and cold and the constant management of things that could go wrong? She understood it, if so. She understood it better tonight than she had understood anything about the previous brides when Prescott had told her their stories in his pipe smoke office. But understanding it was not the same as being defeated by it. She got up and put more wood in the stove and made tea and sat at the kitchen table in her nightgown and wool socks, and read for an hour until the alertness quieted and she felt less like a woman lying awake worrying and more like a woman who was simply awake. There was a difference. She went back to bed and slept until the horses needed feeding. The second day brought a problem she hadn't anticipated. One of the younger cattle, a 2-year-old she'd started privately calling number 7, because he was the 7th she could spot without counting, a rust-colored animal with a notch in his right ear, was off. Not lame, not downed, just off in the way animals are sometimes off when something is wrong that you can't see yet. He was at the edge of the herd when the others were clustered, and his head was lower than it should be. And when she moved the group from the north pasture to the south for their afternoon feeding, he moved slow. She stood outside the fence and looked at him for a long time, running through everything Luke had told her about the cattle, everything she'd observed in 2 months of watching him work with them. She didn't know what was wrong. She knew enough to know that she didn't know, which was its own kind of knowledge. There was a rancher named Tom Haskell up the valley, Luke's nearest neighbor, the one who'd had the trouble with the cougar the previous fall. She had met him once, briefly, when he'd ridden by in January to exchange some information about snow conditions on the North Pass. He had been a large, quiet man of about 50, with a weathered face and a direct manner that reminded her slightly of Luke, the way some men who work the same kind of land in the same kind of weather end up resembling each other in ways that have nothing to do with appearance. She could ride to Haskell's. It was 4 miles. The day was cold but clear, and she knew the route. She thought about what Luke would do. Luke would know what was wrong with the animal, which removed the decision. Luke was not here. She saddled Iris and rode to Haskell's. Tom Haskell came out of his barn when he heard her coming, and he looked at her on the horse with an expression that said he was noting that Luke was not with her, but was too polite to say so in a way that implied weakness. "Mrs. Carver," he said. "Mr. Haskell, I'm sorry to come without notice. I have a 2-year-old that's behaving off, and Luke's out tracking the cougar. I don't know what I'm looking at, and I'd rather ask than wait." Haskell considered this for about 2 seconds. "Let me get my coat," he said. He rode back with her to Cedar Creek and spent 20 minutes with number 7 in the south pasture. He checked the animal methodically, mouth, eyes, belly, legs, and then stood back and looked at it for a moment. "Pink eye starting in the left eye," he said. "Caught it early. You want to treat it soon." "What's the treatment?" He told her. It was straightforward, a solution she would need from the feed store in Mill Haven, applied carefully, with the animal restrained. Not dangerous, not an emergency, but the kind of thing that if left untreated would get worse in the way problems did when you left them alone. "I can ride to Mill Haven tomorrow," she said. "I've got some of the solution at my place," Haskell said. "Bought extra after last fall. You can take what you need and square it with Luke when he's back." She looked at him. He was looking at number 7 with the careful, unconcerning face of a man offering help in a way that wasn't going to embarrass anyone. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate that." "Luke would do the same," Haskell said simply. Riding back to Cedar Creek in the late afternoon with the medicine in her saddlebag, Clara thought about that. Luke would do the same, and understood that it meant something specific about how Luke stood in this community, this spare and widely scattered community of people who were neighbors in the way frontier. People were neighbors, not close by geography, but connected by the practical necessity of mutual survival, by the understanding that in this place a person who refused to help when help was needed was creating the conditions for their own eventual disaster. She treated number 7 the next morning with more difficulty than she'd anticipated. The animal was not interested in being restrained, and she had to improvise a system using the fence posts and a rope that worked imperfectly, but worked. And by the time she was done, she was covered in a combination of mud and the animal's opinions about the procedure. And she stood outside the pasture fence and looked at her coat and thought, "No, I will not be upset about this coat." She went inside and changed and put the coat to soak and made coffee and started the day. Luke came back on the evening of the 3rd day. She heard the horse first, a sound she'd been half listening for without meaning to, a background frequency in her attention for 3 days. And she went to the door and looked out into the dusk and saw him coming across the yard, the horse moving slow the way horses do at the end of a long day. She did not run out. She stayed in the doorway. He saw her and raised one hand slightly, not a wave, just an acknowledgement, and rode past toward the barn. She went back inside and put more wood in the stove and added water to the stew she'd been making, and 10 minutes later she heard his boots on the porch. He came in, and he looked tired in a way that went past the physical, the kind of tired that's also something else, some close engagement with a hard and serious thing that has left its mark. "Did you find it?" she asked. "Found it," he said. "It won't be coming back." She nodded. She didn't ask for details. He sat down at the kitchen table and she poured him coffee and set the stew on, and then she sat down across from him. "Number 7 has pink eye," she said. "Caught it on the 2nd day. I rode to Haskell's. He had the treatment on hand. I've been applying it twice daily. The eye looks better." Luke looked at her across the table. "Which one's number 7? He asked. "Rust-colored, notch in the right ear. 7th one you can spot without counting." The corner of his mouth moved, just barely. "I call him Red." "Red is a better name," she said. He picked up his coffee. He looked at her over the rim of the cup, and she saw something in his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not the recalculation look, not the careful assessing expression, but something that had let go of some of its guardedness. The way a door looks different when the latch has been released even before anyone pushes it open. The east fence post on the third section from the north, she said. It heaved in the freeze. I braced it. It needs proper resetting. I'll do it tomorrow. I made a note in the log. He lowered the cup. The log? I started keeping a log, daily, what I checked, what I found, what I did about it. She paused. It seemed like the kind of thing that would be useful to have. He was quiet for a moment. Haskell came out himself, he said. He did. He was matter-of-fact about it. She met his eyes. He said you'd do the same. Something moved through Luke's expression at that. She didn't try to name it. He's right, Luke said. She got up and served the stew. He ate without ceremony, the way a man eats when he's been out in the cold for 3 days on whatever he'd packed. And she sat across from him and ate her own portion, and the kitchen was warm and the stove was steady, and outside the night was the particular blue-black of a clear Wyoming sky, with the stars beginning to come out. "Clara," he said. She looked up. He was looking at her with the open-door expression, the one that had let go of some of its guardedness. He said, "You kept the ranch." Simple. Direct. Just those 4 words. She held his gaze for a moment. "That's what I'm here for," she said. "No," he said, and something in his voice had changed in a way she couldn't quite locate. A different register, quieter and more careful. "You're here because of an arrangement and a practical necessity, and the fact that Prescott ran out of other options." He set down his spoon. "But that's not why you kept it." She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "It's not." He nodded once, slow, the way he nodded when a thing had been established that he intended to remember. They finished eating. She cleared the table. He helped, which he did not always do, stacking the bowls and bringing them to the wash basin without being asked. And they moved around the small kitchen with the ease of 2 people who had learned, over 2 months of shared mornings and long cold evenings, the particular choreography of each other's movements. It was later. She was at the wash basin, and he was at the table with the log she'd been keeping, reading through it with the careful attention he gave to anything he wanted to understand, that he said, without looking up from the pages, "I want to change the arrangement." She went very still. Her hands kept moving in the wash water. "What do you mean?" she said carefully. "The arrangement we came to, the practical arrangement." He was still looking at the log. "I want to change it to something else." "What's something else?" He looked up then. His eyes were dark and serious and completely unguarded in a way she had never seen them before, a way that cost him something visible. "A real marriage," he said, "if that's something you'd want." The kitchen was very quiet. The stove ticked. The wind moved outside. She turned around and looked at him, this difficult, silent, honest man who had rebuilt every fence on his property alone and sent 3 women back to town and had nevertheless sat down on the kitchen floor beside her in February and read through her log like it was something worth reading. "Luke," she said, "I have been working toward a real marriage since the day I arrived." Something in his face shifted completely. Not a smile, not quite, but the expression of a man who has been bracing for a long time against something that has just unexpectedly resolved in his favor and does not yet entirely know how to occupy the new space. "I didn't know that," he said. "I know you didn't," she said. "I was waiting for you to be ready to know it." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm ready." She turned back to the wash basin, and she was smiling, and she let herself smile because he couldn't see her face, and because some things you are allowed to feel completely before you organize them into words. In the way it changed every spring, imperceptibly at first, then all at once, like a decision that has been building for a long time and then is simply made. The snow began to pull back from the south-facing slopes first. Then the days reached a point where the temperature climbed above freezing in the afternoon for a few hours at a stretch, and the sound of the ranch changed, the absolute silence of deep winter giving way to the sounds of melt, the quiet drip and run of water finding its way downhill. The cattle moved differently. Clara noticed this before she could have explained it. A loosening in the herd, a willingness to range further from the cluster, an anticipation in the animals that made her think, they know. They've been through this before. They're reading signs she couldn't read yet. She was learning to read them. Alderley came back in the second week of March with news about the water rights case. He sat at the kitchen table. She had come to think of the kitchen table as the table where important things happened at Cedar Creek, which was perhaps just the nature of the frontier, where the kitchen was the only room that stayed warm enough to conduct business in. And he laid out what he had. Webb has retained cousins, Alderley said, out of Cheyenne. Luke's expression didn't change, but his hands tightened slightly on his coffee cup. Clara noticed. Cousins is good, Alderley continued. Not better than the documentation we have, but he'll find the weakest points and push there, which is the 1882 gap. We found a letter, Clara said, from that fall. Luke wrote to his supplier about the channel work, mentioned in passing that he'd been delayed by the roof repair. It places him on the property in September working on structures other than the channel. Alderley looked at her. Do you have it? She got the letter. She had found it 3 weeks ago in the records box, in the middle of a stack of old receipts, and she had set it aside because something in her had said, this matters. She wasn't certain why it mattered then. She was certain now. Alderley read it twice. This helps, he said. It doesn't close the gap entirely, but it contextualizes it. A man dealing with a failing roof does not abandon his water channel out of negligence. He makes a triage decision, which is normal ranch management. He set the letter down. I want to file our full documentation package by end of month. I'd like to include this. It's yours, Luke said. Alderley looked between them for a moment, Clara organizing the copies, Luke watching her with the expression that was no longer quite the recalculation look, but had become something else, something settled. And Clara thought she saw Alderley notice this, file it away with the quiet discretion of a man who had sat at a great many tables in a great many kitchens and understood what he was looking at. You have a strong case, Alderley said. Webb is gambling on intimidation as much as legal argument. If we hold firm through the filing, I believe he'll settle before it goes to a hearing. What does settled look like? Clara asked. His cattle access the tributary for watering only with defined time windows. No channel modification rights. Usage terminates if he fails to maintain his end of the shared fence boundary. Alderley paused. It's not nothing, but it's far less than what he's been angling for, and it comes with legal boundaries he'll have to respect going forward. Luke looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at Clara. She gave him the smallest nod. Her read of it. File, hold, wait for the settlement. File, Luke said. After Alderley left, the ranch settled back into its afternoon rhythms. Luke went out to check the cattle. Clara put the copies back in order and updated the log and then went to the barn to check Iris, who was moving beautifully now, the stone bruise a memory. She stood in Iris's stall with her hand on the mare's neck and thought about the tributary, about Webb, about the letter she'd found in the records box that had been sitting there for 11 years, waiting for someone to understand why it mattered. She thought about what Luke had said 3 days ago. I want to change the arrangement. She thought about herself in December, standing on the Millhaven platform in the cold, watching a man who didn't know how to want things anymore, wondering if she'd made a mistake. She thought about her mother's careful letter, which had arrived 2 weeks ago and said, in its precise way, that she hoped Clara was finding the frontier agreeable, which was her mother's way of saying, are you surviving? She was surviving, more than surviving. Iris turned and pushed her head against Clara's shoulder, the way horses do when they've decided you belong to them, a claim more certain than any arrangement or any legal filing. Clara put her arm around the mare's neck. She heard Luke's boots on the barn floor and looked up. He came into the stall doorway and leaned against the frame, the way he stood when he had nowhere he needed to be for a moment. Red's eye is almost clear, he said. I know, I checked this morning. You've been checking every morning. That's when I check things. He looked at her for a moment, at her arm around Iris's neck, at the ease with which she stood in the stall that 3 months ago she hadn't known how to enter. He said, what are you thinking about? It was the first time he'd asked that. She turned it over for a moment, looking at him in the barn doorway with the late afternoon light behind him. I'm thinking, she said slowly, that I came here with 2 trunks and a broken engagement and a telegram that described me as a problem, and that I have spent 3 months learning the difference between a frozen water line and a cracked one, and that last week I restrained a 2-year-old steer by myself with a fence post and a rope and treated his eye while he expressed his feelings about the situation, and that I am... She stopped, looked at Iris, looked back at Luke. I'm thinking that I am exactly where I am supposed to be. Luke was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said. Just that. Just the one word. In the voice he used when something was true enough that it didn't need anything added to it. She turned back to Iris, and he stayed in the doorway. And the barn held the warmth of the animals, and the smell of hay and cold, and the particular smell of horses, which she had come to love in a way she hadn't expected. And outside the March light was changing again, the days getting longer in the slow Wyoming way, pulling towards something that hadn't arrived yet. It would arrive. She was certain of it now, the way you're certain of things that have stopped being hope and become simple fact. Spring was coming. The water rights case was in Alderley's hands, the cattle were healthy, the ranch was standing. And Luke Carver, who had been alone at Cedar Creek for 4 years and had watched 3 women make their decisions and leave, was standing in a barn doorway watching his wife talk to a horse, with the expression of a man who has stopped waiting for the thing he wanted to be taken away. Spring arrived at Cedar Creek the way Luke had said it would. Not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by a freeze, the snow pulling back from the south pasture, and then a storm that put 6 inches back overnight and made Clara stand at the kitchen window in the morning looking at it with a feeling she recognized as something close to personal offense. Luke saw her face and said, "It does this every year." "I know," she said. "I'm still allowed to find it unreasonable." The corner of his mouth moved. "Fair enough." That was April. By the second week of April, the arguments were resolving themselves in Spring's favor, the way they always did, and the land began to do things that Clara watched with the focused attention of someone learning a language by immersion. The particular green that came up first in the low spots where the snowmelt collected, the way the cattle moved when the ground softened beneath them, the sound the creek made when it was running full and clean versus the sound it made when something was wrong. She was learning to hear the difference. That was what this place had done to her over 4 months. It had tuned her to a different frequency, one she hadn't known existed in December, when she'd stood on the Millhaven platform thinking that the cold was the most important thing to understand about Wyoming. The cold was not the most important thing. The most important thing was attention. You paid attention here, or you paid for it in other ways, and the land had no particular sympathy for which one you chose. The water rights case settled on a Thursday in late April. Alderley sent word by Ryder, a brief note that said simply, "Webb has accepted terms. Filing complete. Come to Millhaven when convenient to sign." Clara read the note at the kitchen table and then read it again and then set it down carefully in the center of the table and sat with it for a moment. Luke was in the barn. She went and found him there, working on the roof section that had needed repair since winter, up on a ladder with a look of focused irritation that suggested the repair was not going entirely as planned. "Alderley sent word," she said. "Webb settled." Luke stopped what he was doing. He looked down at her from the ladder. "Terms?" he said. "His cattle can access the tributary for watering only. Defined time windows. No modification rights. Usage terminates if he fails to maintain his end of the shared fence boundary." She had memorized the terms. She'd been moving them around in her mind since she read them, checking them from different angles. "It's what Alderley predicted." Luke climbed down from the ladder. He stood on the barn floor and looked at the note she'd brought with her, and she handed it to him, and he read it and looked up. "He folded," Luke said. "The documentation made it too expensive to fight." She paused. "Your documentation, 4 years of records." "Our documentation," he said. She looked at him for a moment. He said it the way he said things he meant simply and without embellishment, the way he'd said, "I'm ready in the kitchen in March." She had learned to hear what was behind his economy of words. Not coldness, not indifference, but a man who had spent so long with only himself for company that language had become something he used carefully, the way you use a good tool, precisely when it was needed and not otherwise. "We should go to Millhaven tomorrow," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll need to buy Haskell's medicine too. Square the debt." "I already sent him a note. He said there was no debt." Luke looked at her. "I told him there was," she said, "and that we'd settle it in kind when we had the chance." Another moment. He turned back to the ladder. "Good," he said, and climbed back up. She stood in this barn for a moment, looking at the section of roof he was repairing, the way the new boards sat against the old weathered ones, the visible record of what had been damaged and what was being made sound again. Then she went back to the house and started a letter to her mother. Millhaven in late April was a different town than the one she'd first seen in December, which is to say it was the same 14 buildings and the same people, but with mud instead of ice, and a quality of movement that suggested everyone was catching up on everything they hadn't been able to do for 4 months. She and Luke drove in on the wagon, which was itself a different experience than the December drive. The road still rough but not frozen, the landscape doing its green and brown tentative spring thing, the sky a color she hadn't seen since arriving, something closer to blue. They went to Alderley's office first. The lawyer had papers ready and walked them through each page with the same unhurried thoroughness he brought to everything. And Luke signed where he was asked to sign, and Clara witnessed, and when it was done, Alderley shook Luke's hand and then Clara's. "The documentation was the case," Alderley said to her directly. "I want you to know that." "Luke kept the records," she said. "You organized them into an argument." He held her gaze. "That's not the same thing as keeping records, Mrs. Carver. It's a different skill." She thanked him and they left, and she did not say anything to Luke about what Alderley had said, because some things were better held quietly than displayed. They went to the feed store. They went to the dry goods. Dot came around from behind her counter when she saw Clara and took both her hands and said, "You made it through the winter," in the tone of someone confirming a thing they'd hoped for but weren't entirely certain of. "I made it through the winter," Clara said. Dot looked at her with sharp, kind eyes. "You look different than you did in December." "I imagine I do." "Good different." Dot squeezed her hands once and released them. "Luke treating you right?" "Luke is," Clara considered, "Luke is exactly who he said he was. That turns out to be enough." Dot made a sound of satisfaction, the particular sound of a woman who has been right about something and is gratified to have it confirmed. They ate lunch at the small eating house on the main street, a place with 4 tables and a woman named Ruth, who cooked a beef stew that was straightforward and hot and required no further recommendation. Luke ate across from her and they talked about the barn roof and the spring cattle count and whether the north pasture had drained enough yet to move the herd back. Then a man came in who Clara had not seen before, and the quality of the room changed slightly in the way rooms change when someone enters who carries something difficult with them. He was maybe 60, square-built, with the look of a man who had worked outside his whole life and was now past the point where it came easily. He stood in the doorway and looked around the room and found Luke, and something moved across his face. Not hostility, but the particular discomfort of a person carrying an obligation they would rather not be carrying. "Carver," he said. Luke looked up. He went very still for just a moment, barely visible, the kind of stillness that came before something he'd been waiting for arrived. "Dornan," he said. The man, Dornan, came to stand near the table. He did not sit down. He looked at Clara with the brief, noting look of a man who has just registered her existence and is filing it away. "I heard you settled with Webb," Dornan said. "This morning," Luke said. Dornan turned his hat in his hands. "I want to say something, Carver, and I'd appreciate it if you let me say it." Luke said nothing, which was as much permission as Dornan was likely to get. 3 years ago, when Webb came to me about the water situation, he came to me before he came to you, did you know that? Dornan looked at the hat in his hands. "He wanted me to sign a statement about the tributary, said the channel had been unmanaged for years, that you'd neglected it." Clara set down her fork very quietly. "I knew that wasn't true," Dornan said. "I'd seen you out there working the channel. I knew it." He stopped. "I signed it anyway. Webb had some business leverage over me at the time. I signed it and I've been..." Another stop. "That statement's what gave him the confidence to push you on the rights. You should know that." The eating house was very quiet. Ruth had found something to do near the kitchen doorway. The other 2 people at the other table were looking at their food. Luke looked at Dornan for a long moment. "I know," Luke said. "Alderley told me when we filed." Dornan looked up. Something in his face was asking a question that he didn't seem to know how to form into words. "The statement didn't hold," Luke said. "Webb's leverage on you ran out when the documentation was strong enough. Alderley said Cousins told Webb the statement was the weakest part of his case." He looked at Dornan steadily. "You didn't cost me the water rights." Dornan was quiet for a moment. "Could have, though." "Could have," Luke agreed, "but didn't." A long silence. Dornan put his hat back on. "I'm sorry, Carver," he said. It was a plain sentence, neither dramatic nor minimal. Just a man saying the thing he'd come to say. "All right," Luke said. Dornan nodded once and left. The room breathed again. Ruth went back to her kitchen. The other diners resumed their lunch. Clara looked at Luke across the table. He was looking at his stew. "You knew," she said quietly. "Since February. Alderley found the statement in Webb's filing." "You didn't tell me." "No." She considered this. "Why not?" He looked up. "Because I didn't need you to be angry on my behalf. I had Alderley working the problem. More anger in the room wasn't going to help." She looked at him for a moment. There was something in what he'd said, "angry on my behalf," that she wanted to take apart later and examine, because it said something about how he understood the space between them now, what he thought she felt for him, what he was beginning to allow himself to believe. "He'll be a better neighbor than Webb," she said. "Probably. Guilt has a way of making people generous." She picked up her fork. "We should let it." Luke looked at her with something that was not quite amusement, but inhabited the same neighborhood. "You think like a strategist," he said. "I think like a woman who grew up watching men make decisions about rooms she was supposed to be decorating," she said. "You learn to see the angles." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm glad you're on my side of it." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. The barn roof got finished in the first week of May, which Luke considered slightly behind schedule and Clara considered a reasonable outcome given everything else that had been happening. She helped with the last section, handing up boards and holding the ladder and doing the ground-level work that required two people, even when a man as self-sufficient as Luke Carver was running the operation. And when it was done, he climbed down and they both stood back and looked at it. "It'll hold," he said. "It looks like it'll hold," she agreed. She knew enough by now to understand that looking like it would hold and holding were close but not the same thing, and that the difference would reveal itself in the next hard rain. The next hard rain came 4 days later and the roof held. She wrote in the log, "Roof repair complete. First rain test passed." Luke read the log on Sunday evenings now, which had become a quiet habit between them. She would leave it on the table after her weekly summary entry, and he would read it with his coffee, occasionally making a small note in the margin in his own handwriting. It had started without discussion, the way most of their habits started. She had noticed the marginal notes appearing one week, and had read them and found they were clarifications, additions, things she'd observed from one angle and he from another, so that the log was beginning to be a document of two perspectives on the same place. She thought sometimes about what that log would look like in 10 years. 20. What a record of this place would accumulate into, if they kept at it. May brought the kind of work that was different from winter work. Not harder in the cold survival sense, but more constant, more varied. The ranch coming back to life in ways that demanded response on all sides at once. The cattle were moved to the north pasture. The kitchen garden needed starting, which Clara had been planning since March, drawing out what she intended to plant in what arrangement based on the sun angles she'd tracked through the winter. Luke looked at her planning drawings once and said nothing about them, but she noticed he built a small additional fence section along the south side of the garden plot without being asked, which solved a drainage problem she'd been trying to figure out how to address. She did not say, "Thank you for solving the drainage problem." She said, "The south fence section is the right height." He said, "I figured." That was how they talked about things now, in the shorthand of people who had stopped explaining themselves to each other, and had started simply responding. She had not known, before Cedar Creek, that a relationship could be built in this particular way, in the accumulated currency of practical exchanges, in the shared language of a place and its demands, in the understanding that developed between two people who had stopped performing and started simply being present. She had known marriages built on performance. Her parents' marriage had been, in certain lights, a sustained performance of mutual sufficiency. Many of the Boston marriages she'd observed had been arrangements between public selves, the real selves remaining private and sometimes unmet for decades. She had thought as a girl that this was simply what marriage was, a formal agreement between two people who would negotiate the territory of actual knowing separately and slowly, if ever. What she had at Cedar Creek was something else. It had been built in kitchens and barns and frozen pastures and on the seat of a wagon in the dark. It had been built out of things going wrong, and both of them dealing with what went wrong. It had no performance in it, because there had never been time or energy for performance, and she thought sometimes that the hardship of the place had been, in its way, a gift. It had stripped everything away until what was left was just the two of them, actual and present, and unable to be anything other than what they were. Tom Haskell came by in mid-May, as he occasionally did, to exchange information and drink coffee and conduct the kind of ranching conversation that was partly practical and partly the social necessity of people who lived 4 miles from their nearest neighbor and needed, sometimes, to talk to someone outside their own walls. He and Luke sat at the kitchen table. Clara sat with them, which had taken some adjustment on Haskell's part in the beginning. He was a man of his generation and his habits, and the habit was that women moved in and out of rooms where men talked, not that they stayed and participated. He had adjusted over a few visits, helped by the fact that Clara did not make a point of her presence but simply occupied it, and by the fact that she occasionally said something that was worth hearing. This visit, Haskell said, "There's a woman named Pierce in Mill Haven looking to establish a small school. She needs a place to meet until she can get a proper building. Asked if I knew anyone with a space." Clara looked up from the seedling chart she'd been updating. "How many children?" she said. Haskell looked at her. 8, maybe 10, from 4 or 5 families. "How long until she could get a building?" "Depends on the territory school fund. Could be a year, could be longer." She looked at Luke. He was looking at the table with the expression of a man who has not yet been asked a question, but can feel it arriving. "We have the space," she said. "The front room is large enough for 10 children." Luke looked up. "Once a week," she said. "It doesn't have to be more than that to start. It gives the children something regular, and it gives Miss Pierce a place to work until the building comes through." Luke turned this over. She could see him doing it, the private consideration, the checking of angles. "It means people coming to the ranch," he said. "Yes, regularly." "Once a week," she said. "You can be in the barn." Something shifted in his expression, not quite amusement, but the recognition of being seen accurately. "You should meet her first," he said. "See if she's worth the trouble." "I'll go to Millhaven Thursday," Clara said. Haskell was looking between them with the expression of a man who has just watched something he finds interesting and is deciding whether to comment. He decided not to. She went to Millhaven Thursday and met Eleanor Pierce, who was 26, direct-eyed, and had come from Ohio with a teaching certificate, and the particular stubbornness of a person who has decided to do something and intends to do it, regardless of what the circumstances suggest about the likelihood of success. Clara liked her immediately, which was a response she did not always have to people quickly. They talked for an hour in Dot's store, and Clara understood that Eleanor Pierce was not a woman looking for charity. She was a woman with a plan looking for a space. Those were different things, and the difference mattered. She told Luke that evening, "She's competent. She knows what she's trying to build." "What did you tell her about the space?" "I told her I'd confirm with my husband." She looked at him directly. "I'm confirming." Luke was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. The school began the first Thursday of June. 8 children between the ages of 6 and 12, arriving in the morning with their mothers, who sat on the porch or in the yard in the early summer warmth, while Eleanor conducted her class inside. Clara watched through the kitchen doorway the first week, and then found herself drawn in the second week to sit with the mothers, who were women she had seen in Millhaven but not talked to at any length. Their names were May and Judith and Ellen and Ruth. Not the Ruth from the eating house, a different Ruth, one with 3 children and a sense of humor that came out in dry asides. They talked about practical things mostly, gardens and livestock, and the particular challenges of keeping a household running in a territory that made everything harder than it needed to be. They talked about their children, they talked about the winter past and the summer ahead. They talked to Clara like she was a person. This sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. She had been, since arriving in Wyoming, performing some version of a probationary existence. The new wife, the Boston woman, the 4th try, the one who might or might not last. The women on her porch on those Thursday mornings did not talk to her that way. They talked to her like she was a neighbor, like she was a known quantity, like she had established herself somewhere in the accounting of this community. She understood, sitting with them on the second Thursday of June, with a cup of coffee and the sound of children learning arithmetic coming through the window behind her, that she had. May Dawson, she was the one with twins and an apricot tree she was trying to establish against all reasonable odds, said one morning, without particular preamble, Luke seems different this spring. Clara looked at her. Came to the Haskell gathering in April, May said. He hasn't come to a gathering in 2 years. She picked at a loose thread on her cuff. He talked to people. He's capable of talking to people, Clara said carefully. Oh, I know, but he didn't used to bother. May looked at her with the direct kindness of a woman who means exactly what she says. That's down to you, Mrs. Carver. Clara looked at the yard. He did that himself. Maybe, May said. But people don't often do things themselves without someone making it easier to do them. Clara said nothing because there was nothing to add that would improve on the accuracy of that. The Webb settlement had a secondary effect that Alderley had anticipated and mentioned in passing, and that Clara now watched develop in the particular way that information moved through a small frontier community, not all at once, but steadily, through conversations and observations and the gradual accumulation of a new understanding. What people understood now was that Luke Carver had fought Webb and won. In a territory where water was the difference between a viable ranch and a failed one, and where Webb had made himself an obstacle to more than one ranching family over the past few years, this mattered. It mattered in a specific practical way because it established that Webb's methodology could be defeated, that documentation and persistence and a good lawyer were sufficient against the kind of pressure he used, which had always been the case but had not been demonstrated clearly enough for people to believe it. Dornan came by in June. He did not come to the house. He came to the fence line, which was a distinction she understood was deliberate, a man establishing that he was not asking for more than he'd already been given. He told Luke that he'd spoken to 2 other ranchers Webb had pushed on, and that they had documentation of their own that might be worth having a lawyer look at. Luke listened. He said Alderley would be willing to talk to them. He said he would make the introduction. On the ride back to the house afterward, Clara said, "You could have done that 2 years ago." "I didn't have what I needed 2 years ago," he said. She thought about that. "The documentation." "Partly." He glanced at her sideways. "Partly other things." She did not ask what other things. She thought she knew, and she thought the knowing was enough without making him say it. Webb himself she saw only once more that summer, at a distance, in Mill Haven. I was coming out of the bank, and she was going into the dry goods, and they passed each other on the wooden walkway with perhaps 10 feet between them. He looked at her with an expression she took a moment to identify. It was not anger, it was something more complicated than anger. The expression of a man reassessing something he'd underestimated, filing the reassessment away without pleasure. She did not acknowledge him. She went into the dry goods and bought what she needed and came out, and the street was his again to do what he liked with. She did not think about him again for a long time. The summer moved fast in the way summers do when there is enough work to fill every hour of the light. The cattle did well. The garden did better than she'd expected from a first-year attempt. The beans were strong, the potatoes established, the tomatoes slower but present. Luke picked the first ripe tomato in late July and brought it inside without comment and set it on the counter, and she understood it was an offering of a specific kind. He had been watching the garden, had known when it was ready, had brought it in because it was a thing worth marking. She sliced it and put it on the table at dinner, and they ate it in the particular appreciative silence of people who have earned something through months of work and are now tasting the result. "Next year," she said, "I want to add a second row of beans and try squash along the south fence." "The south fence gets afternoon shade," he said. "I know. I'm going to try a variety that tolerates shade." He looked at her. "Where'd you read about that?" "I wrote to a seed company in Ohio. They sent information." He was quiet for a moment. "You wrote to a seed company?" "In February. I had a plan." He shook his head slightly, not in disagreement, in something closer to wonder, the way he sometimes looked at her when she had done something that reminded him, visibly, that she was a whole person with an interior life full of plans and intentions that he was only ever going to know partially. "You had a plan," he said. "I always have a plan," she said. "You've known this about me for 7 months." "I know," he said. "I'm still getting used to it." She looked at him. I was looking at his plate with the small private expression she had come to love. The one that meant something amused him, but he wasn't going to make a production of it. She had come to love it in the specific way you love something that belongs entirely to one person, that you know because you have been paying close attention. The evenings were long in summer, and they used them differently than they'd used the winter evenings. Less time inside, more time on the porch, or walking the fence lines in the late light, moving through the ranch together in a way that was not purposeful exactly, but was not purposeless either. The way you move through a place that belongs to you, checking on it, being present in it. One evening in August, she was on the porch when Luke came out and sat down beside her, and they watched the sun go down behind the western ridge in the particular slow way Wyoming sunsets moved, like the light was reluctant to leave. She had something to tell him. She had known it for 3 weeks, had been sitting with the knowledge the way she sat with things that were important, turning it over, checking it, making sure she understood what she was holding before she handed it to someone else. "Luke," she said. "Yeah." She looked at the sunset for a moment. "We're going to need to think about the back bedroom," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She heard him go still the way he went still when something had arrived that he needed a moment to take in. "Clara," he said. "Spring," she said. "I think spring." Another silence. She turned to look at him and found him looking at her, and his expression was, she did not have a word for it. She had spent 8 months learning the vocabulary of Luke Carver's face, and this was an expression she had not seen before. It was not the recalculation look, not the open door look, not the small private amusement. It was something she thought she might only see a few times in a life. The expression of a man for whom something has arrived that he stopped believing would arrive, and who is now working out how to exist inside a world where it has. He reached over and put his hand over hers on the porch rail. He didn't say anything. For once, the silence between them was not his. It was both of theirs. The shared silence of two people sitting inside a moment too large for words, watching the last of the summer light leave the sky above Cedar Creek. After a while, she turned her hand over and held his. They sat there until the stars came out, which took longer in summer than in winter, and when they finally came, they came all at once the way they did on clear August nights in Wyoming, the whole enormous sky going from dark to brilliant between one breath and the next, and the ranch below it quiet and whole and theirs. The back bedroom had been used for storage since before Clara arrived. Boxes of old receipts, a broken chair Luke had never gotten around to fixing, 2 crates of equipment that had no other obvious home. She began clearing it in September, which gave her something to do with the particular energy of a person who has news they've been sitting with and needs to move it somewhere physical. Luke helped without being asked, which was how he helped with most things now. He carried the crates to the barn and found a place for the broken chair in the woodpile and stood in the doorway of the emptied room looking at it with the expression of a man who is trying to see something that isn't there yet. "It needs light," Clara said. She was standing beside him. "Windows face east," he said. "Gets the morning." "That's good for a child." He was quiet for a moment. "What else does it need?" She had a list. She had been building the list in her head for 3 weeks and committing pieces of it to paper when she was certain enough about each item to write it down. She told him the list, a proper bed frame, which the room lacked, and a second window if it was possible. And the walls needed fresh whitewash because the current plaster had gone gray and damp in one corner that she intended to find the source of before winter. Luke listened to the whole list without interruption. "The corner is a roof joint that needs recaulking," he said. "I know where it is. I've been meaning to get to it. Get to it before the cold." "I know." She looked at him standing in the doorway of the empty room, this man who had built everything at Cedar Creek with his own hands and his own stubbornness, and had almost no one to build it for. And she thought about what that must have felt like, the specific loneliness of building and maintaining and protecting something with no clear answer to the question of why. She did not say any of that. Some thoughts are true enough to keep private. "The bed frame," she said. "I want to look in Mill Haven before we order from the catalog." "We'll go Saturday," he said. They went Saturday. Mill Haven had exactly one option for a bed frame at the furniture shop, which was a solid pine construction with no decoration and no pretension, and was exactly right. Luke examined the joints with the critical attention of a man who builds things and knows what failing joints look like, and apparently found them satisfactory because he straightened up and told the shop owner he'd take it. On the way home, Clara said, "I've been thinking about names." Luke glanced at her sideways. "It's early," she said, "and I'm not attached to anything yet, but I've been thinking." "What have you been thinking?" "If it's a girl, I'd like her to have a name that means something, not fashionable, something with weight to it." She paused. "My grandmother's name was Nora. I've always liked it." Luke was quiet for a moment. My mother's name was Alice, he said. She looked at him. He rarely mentioned his mother. He rarely mentioned anyone from before Cedar Creek, and she had learned not to push on those silences because they were different from his other silences. Not withholding exactly, but carefully closed, the way you close a door on a room that has been sorted through and organized as well as it's going to get, and now just needs to be left alone. Nora Alice, she said. He looked at the road ahead. She saw his jaw work slightly. If it's a girl, he said. If it's a girl, she agreed. They drove the rest of the way home. In a silence that had something new in it, a warmth she couldn't have described precisely, but that she felt along her whole side, the side nearest to him on the wagon seat, like the warmth that radiates from a fire that has been burning long enough to heat the stones around it. October brought the second winter, and Clara met it differently than she'd met the first. The difference was not that she knew everything now, she didn't, and she had enough experience of Cedar Creek to understand that she never entirely would, that the ranch had surprises built into it the way any living place did, and that the appropriate response to that was not mastery, but readiness. The difference was that she was ready. Her body knew the work. Her hands moved without the hesitation of December. She knew the sound of the water line before it froze, and the particular way Iris moved when she was cold versus when she was genuinely bothered. And she knew which fence sections needed checking after a north wind and which ones could wait. She also knew Luke. That was perhaps the largest difference. She knew when to leave his silences alone and when they needed a question. She knew the specific quality of his tiredness at the end of a hard day and how to read whether it was the kind that wanted company or the kind that wanted quiet. She knew that he checked on her without making it visible, that when she'd been in the barn for what he considered too long, he would find a reason to come out there, and that when she was quieter than usual, he would, eventually, say her name in that particular even tone that meant he was paying attention. She knew that he was paying attention. That was what she knew, at the core of it. After 28 years of being in rooms where people registered her existence primarily as a problem to be managed, she was in a place where someone paid attention to her the way you pay attention to something that matters. She had not known she was hungry for that until she had it. The first hard freeze of October came on a Wednesday night, and she banked the stove the way she'd learned to bank it, and she checked the water line, and she lay in the dark listening to the wind and thought, I know this particular sound, and she slept. Her mother came in November. This required more logistical arrangement than anything Clara had organized at Cedar Creek, including the water rights case, because her mother was a woman who did not travel without considerable preparation and who had very precise ideas about what arrangements were acceptable and what were not. Clara had been writing to her since January, careful measured letters that described the ranch and the work and Luke in terms that she hoped conveyed reality without provoking alarm. Her mother had written back in kind, careful, measured, reading between every line the way Clara knew she was. The letter that finally said I would like to come and see it myself had arrived in August, and Clara had held it for a long time before she wrote back and said, yes. Come in November before the worst of the winter. Come for 2 weeks. She told Luke that evening. He was quiet for longer than usual. Your mother, he said finally. She wants to see the ranch. She wants to see you. Both, Clara said. She won't say that directly. She'll say she wants to see the ranch. Another pause. What do I need to know? She looked at him. The question was so entirely Luke, practical, direct, not performing any feeling about it, just identifying what information he needed to manage the situation. She's a formal woman, Clara said. She was raised to be formal, and she married formal, and she can't entirely turn it off, even when she wants to. She will be polite to you. She will observe everything and form opinions and not express most of them. Clara paused. She loves me. She's not always known how to show that in ways that are useful, but she loves me. All right, Luke said. You don't have to charm her. I don't know how to charm people, he said. I know, just be what you are. He looked at her for a moment. What I am has been a problem for some people. My mother is not those people, Clara said. She respects competence. She respects honesty. She's going to watch how you treat me, and she's going to see what she sees, and that's going to be enough. He accepted this and did not raise it again. Margaret Hawthorne arrived on the Millhaven stage on a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of November, and she stepped down from the coach with the careful dignity of a woman who has just endured 3 days of travel and intends to give no indication of it. She was 61, slim, straight-backed, with Clara's eyes and Clara's jaw, and an expression of contained assessment that Clara recognized because she sometimes saw it in her own mirror. Luke had the wagon. He lifted her trunk without ceremony and loaded it and helped her up to the seat and drove with the same even competence he brought to everything. And Clara watched her mother watching him the way her mother watched everything, carefully, cataloging. He showed her to the guest room, the back bedroom, which had been finished in October, the bed frame installed, the corner sealed, the walls freshly whitewashed, a rag rug Clara had made from old wool coats on the floor. Margaret stood in the doorway and looked at it and said, "This is very clean." "Clara worked on it through September," Luke said. Margaret looked at him. He looked back evenly, and then excused himself to take the horse back to the barn. Margaret turned to Clara. "He's quieter than I expected," she said. "He's consistent," Clara said. "It reads as quiet." Her mother looked at her for a long moment with the particular expression that meant she was computing several things at once. "You look well," she said, and coming from Margaret Hawthorne, who did not distribute observations about appearance casually, this was a considered statement. "I am well," Clara said. The 2 weeks were not without friction, because nothing in life is, and because Margaret Hawthorne had spent 28 years understanding her daughter in a particular way and was now revising that understanding in real time, which was not comfortable for either of them. She asked questions about the ranch management that were penetrating and occasionally undermining in their framing, the way a person asks questions when they are not certain they want the answer to be good. She expressed concern about the isolation, about the winter, about the medical situation 14 miles from town, about the coming child in the particular way of a woman from a generation that knew what could go wrong and felt that knowing should be stated clearly. Clara answered every question directly. She did not perform contentment. She did not soften the realities of Cedar Creek into something more palatable. She said, "The isolation is real, and I have found ways to work within it. The winter is hard, and I have learned to manage hard winters. The distance from town is a genuine limitation, and we plan for it. The child will come in spring, and we have spoken to the doctor in Millhaven, and we know what we need to know." Her mother listened to all of it. On the 10th day, Margaret asked to walk the property. Clara went with her, and they walked the south pasture and the kitchen garden, put to bed for winter now, the bare beds covered with straw, and along the fence line where the tributary ran, silver and cold in the November light. Her mother stopped at the fence and looked at the water. "This is what the legal trouble was about," she said. "Part of it runs along our eastern boundary. Webb wanted shared usage rights he wasn't entitled to. And you organized the documentation. Luke had the records. I organized them into an argument." Margaret was quiet for a moment, looking at the water. "Alderley's letter to you mentioned that." Clara looked at her. "You spoke to Alderley?" "I wrote to him before I came." Her mother's voice was even, unapologetic. "I wanted an accounting of the situation from someone who wasn't you." Clara felt a flash of something, not quite anger, but its cousin. Then she thought, this is exactly what I would have done. This is where I learned to check the source. "What did he tell you?" she said. "That you had good judgment, and that Cedar Creek Ranch was in better legal standing than it had been in several years." Margaret paused. "He also said that your husband was a man who knew his land and his rights, and had the stubbornness to defend them, which he meant as a compliment." "It is one," Clara said. Her mother turned from the fence and looked at her. Really looked at her, with the full attention she usually kept partitioned into smaller, safer portions. "You're happy," Margaret said. It came out sounding slightly surprised, and then her mother caught the surprise in her own voice and adjusted. "I don't mean, I know the work is hard. I know it's not what you grew up with." "No," Clara said, "it's not." "But you're—" Her mother seemed to be looking for the right word, which was unusual, because Margaret Hawthorne generally had the right word. "I'm exactly where I am," Clara said. "I'm not somewhere easier pretending to be somewhere harder. I'm not somewhere harder pretending to be fine. I'm here, and here is difficult and real, and mine, and I am—" She stopped, looked at the water. "I am the most myself I have ever been." Her mother was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I didn't understand when you left why you couldn't simply— I know. The situation with Finch, it seemed like a small thing to— I know, Mother." Margaret folded her hands in front of her, the gesture Clara had seen her whole life, the gesture that meant she was organizing herself. "I have been wrong about some things," she said. Clara looked at her. Coming from her mother, this was not a small sentence. It was the kind of sentence that cost something real. "You were trying to protect me," Clara said, "in the way you understood protection." "I was trying to make you acceptable," her mother said. "I thought acceptable meant safe." She looked out at the pasture. "I was wrong about that." Clara said nothing. Some corrections don't need commentary. They just need to be received. They walked back to the house in a silence that was different from the silences of the previous 10 days. Not careful, not navigating, just two women walking across cold ground toward a warm kitchen with the particular ease of people who have said the hard thing and come out the other side of it. Margaret left on a Thursday, on the morning stage from Mill Haven. She hugged Clara at the stage and held on for a moment longer than her usual embrace, which said everything she hadn't been able to say directly. She shook Luke's hand and looked at him directly and said, "You have a remarkable wife." Luke said, "I know that." Margaret looked at him for a moment, assessing, final, the look of a woman filing a verdict. Whatever she found, it appeared to satisfy her. She got on the stage. Clara watched the stage until it disappeared around the bend in the road and stood in the cold for another moment after it was gone. Luke stood beside her. After a while he said, "She's harder than you." "She made me," Clara said. "You work with what you have." He made a small sound that was the nearest thing to a laugh she'd heard from him in the months she'd known him. Not quite, not fully, but adjacent. She turned to look at him, and he was looking at the road where the stage had been, and the expression on his face was something she thought she'd only fully understand years from now, when she could look back at this moment from a distance. She took his arm, and they walked back to the wagon. The child came in March. Not easily. Nothing at Cedar Creek came easily, and Clara had stopped expecting it to, which was its own kind of preparation. The doctor from Mill Haven arrived in time, barely, having made the 14-mile drive in a March storm that had opinions about the schedule. Luke sat outside the bedroom door for 4 hours in the way men sat outside doors in those circumstances, rigid with the helplessness of it, the being outside the most important thing that was happening. When the doctor opened the door and told him, Luke stood up so fast he caught his shoulder on the doorframe. The child was a girl. She was red-faced and loud and entirely herself from the first moment. And when Luke held her for the first time, standing at the bedside with Clara watching him, her own exhaustion so complete that she felt almost transparent, he held her with the careful, absolute attention of a man who understands that he is holding something that has changed the total of everything. He looked at Clara over the child's head. "Nora," he said. "Nora Alice," Clara said. He looked back at the child. His face was doing something she had never seen it do, something that had no vocabulary in the catalog she'd built of his expressions over 14 months. It was the face of a person for whom the world has just reorganized itself permanently, and who is standing in the exact moment of that reorganization, trying to take in its full scope. She let him stand there as long as he needed to. Spring arrived for the second time at Cedar Creek, and this time Clara watched it come with the specific attention of a person who knows what they're watching. The green coming up in the low spots first, the sound of the creek running full, the cattle moving with their early season looseness. Nora was 3 weeks old and lived in the carrier Clara had sewn from a wool blanket, against Clara's chest or Luke's while they moved through the work of the ranch, which did not pause for new arrivals any more than it paused for anything else. Luke carrying Nora in the carrier while he checked the fence line was something Clara had not anticipated and found she could not look at for very long without something happening in her chest that was almost too large for her body. Eleanor Pierce's school building came through in April. The territory approved the funding, and a crew came out and built a small proper schoolhouse at the edge of Mill Haven in 3 weeks. And the Thursday gatherings at Cedar Creek ended, which Clara had expected and had also, quietly, not wanted. But the women who had come on those Thursdays did not disappear from her life along with the occasion. May Dawson came by in May with cuttings from her apricot tree, wrapped in wet burlap, and told Clara where to plant them for the best chance. Judith brought a quilt when Nora was born. Ellen, who had the driest sense of humor Clara had encountered in Wyoming, came by in June and looked at the baby and looked at Luke and said to Clara, "Well, she's going to be stubborn, That's obvious from both directions. Luke, who was holding Nora at the time, looked at Ellen with an expression that on another man would have been a smile, and on Luke was, in its way, the same thing. In June, a year and a half after Clara Hawthorne had stepped off the train in Mill Haven with 2 trunks and a broken engagement, Alderley sent word that the water rights case had been formally closed, all paperwork completed, all terms entered into the territorial record. He included a note that said, in his plain way, "The record is clear. This will not be reopened." She showed the note to Luke that evening. He read it and set it on the table. "Done," he said. "Done," she agreed. He looked at the note for a moment. Then he looked at her. Nora was asleep in the back bedroom, which had been repainted again. Clara had found a soft yellow that caught the morning light, which she was pleased with and Luke had not complained about, which was his version of being pleased with it too. "I've been thinking," Luke said. "About?" "The log." He was quiet for a moment. "We should keep it going." She looked at him. "We have been keeping it going." "I know, he stopped. "Organize something. I mean formally, as a record, not just daily notes. A proper accounting of the ranch, the decisions, the land." He looked at the window. "If we're building something here, there should be a record of how we built it." She thought about what he'd said. She thought about the margins where he'd been adding his own handwriting for a year, the 2-sided record of the same place, the accumulated picture of Cedar Creek in 2 voices. "You want it to be a document," she said. "I want Nora to be able to read it," he said, "when she's old enough." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the Wyoming summer evening was doing what it did in June, holding the light long past when it should have given way, the sky staying brilliant and pale well into 9 o'clock, as if even the sun found the valley worth staying in a little longer. Clara thought about what it meant, what he was actually saying. Not just the log, not just the record. He was saying, "I am building something I intend to last long enough for our daughter to inherit the story of it." He was saying, "I believe in this enough to write it down." Luke Carver, who had spent 4 years building a ranch that had no witnesses and no heirs, was asking her to help him make a record of a future he now believed in. She got up and went to the shelf where the current log sat and brought it back to the table and set it between them and opened it to the next blank page. She picked up the pen. "Where do you want to start?" she said. He thought for a moment. "From the beginning," he said. "From when you arrived." She looked down at the blank page. She wrote the date, June 1883, and then she wrote, "Clara Carver arrived at Cedar Creek Ranch in December 1882 with 2 trunks and no clear idea of what she was coming to." She paused, read it back, crossed out the last clause, wrote instead, "with 2 trunks," and her eyes open. Luke leaned over and read it. He did not suggest a change. She kept writing. "There is something particular about a person who has been told, repeatedly and in various ways, that they are too much, too direct, too observant, too unwilling to let the wrong things stand uncorrected. Finding a place where those qualities are not liabilities, but the very thing that makes them essential. It is not a simple discovery. It does not come all at once, and it does not come without cost. Clara Hawthorne paid for it in 2 trunks on a train to a stranger's house, and 72 hours of a marriage that ended because she noticed a number was wrong. She paid for it in the long winter and the cold floor and the 9 trips with heavy water buckets, and the nights she lay awake listening for sounds that might mean something was wrong. But what she built at Cedar Creek was hers in the way that only the things we earn are ever truly ours. Not given, not inherited, not arranged. Earned. Every fence post, every water run, every document organized on a kitchen table by lamplight. Earned in the currency of days that asked everything of her and found that everything was enough. And Luke Carver, who had been the wolf of Cedar Creek to anyone who'd heard of him, solitary, difficult, the rancher whose brides left and whose neighbors kept their distance, Luke Carver turned out to be what he had always been underneath the silence and the hard years, a man worth staying for. He simply needed someone who could see that without needing him to perform it, someone who was willing to sit with the reality of who he was long enough to understand that the reality was good. Not perfect. He was never perfect. He forgot to say things that needed saying, and he went quiet when conversation would have helped. And there were mornings she looked at him across the kitchen table, and felt the specific frustration of being with a person who processes their inner life in solitude and expects you to be patient with that. She was not always patient. He was not always fair. They argued in the way of people who are both stubborn and honest, and the arguments were real, and they resolved them with the same directness they'd brought to everything else, by saying the true thing, even when it was the harder thing, and staying in the room until it was said. That is the thing about building a life with someone. It is not one moment of choosing. It is the same choice made on the bad days and the cold mornings and the evenings when you're too tired for generosity and you choose it anyway. Luke chose Clara every day she was there. Clara chose Cedar Creek and its wolf every morning she woke up in it. Nora Alice Carver grew up knowing the fence lines and the water rights, and the name of every animal on the property, and the story of the log on the shelf, which her mother had begun and her father had annotated, and which grew over years into a record of a family that had been built out of two people who had been turned away by the easier version of the world and had found, in the harder one, exactly what they needed. The telegram that had called Clara Hawthorne a problem, buyer beware, 3 days was all any man could stand. That telegram is gone now. Paper doesn't last in Wyoming winters, and no one thought to preserve it. But the log lasts. The ranch lasts. The water runs clean in the tributary that belongs, by law and by record and by the work of two people who refused to let it be taken, to Cedar Creek. And that is where Clara Carver's story ends. Not in triumph, not in the bright, clean way of fairy tales, but in the way of real things that were worth building, quietly, solidly, with her name on the record, and her hands that knew the work, and her daughter sleeping in the yellow morning light of the back bedroom, and her husband at the kitchen table reading last week's log entry with his coffee, going cold beside him because he forgot to drink it, the way he always did when he was reading something carefully. She looked at him across the kitchen and thought, this is the whole of it. Not the absence of hard things, not the resolution of every difficulty, just this man, this place, this ordinary, irreplaceable morning. She picked up his coffee and warmed it and set it back in front of him. He looked up. Thank you, he said. 2 words, plain and direct and entirely sufficient. She sat down across from him, and the morning continued the way all mornings continued at Cedar Creek, with work waiting and light coming through the east window and the sound of the ranch settling into its day around them, ordinary and necessary and fully, entirely theirs.